Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into the daily lives of enslaved people in ancient Rome, specifically what their owners weren't technically allowed to do. Before we get started, make sure to like the video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoyed this kind of content. Drop a comment with where you're rewatching from and what time. I always find it fascinating to see who's tuning in across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that cozy background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Asking what Roman masters couldn't do to their slaves is a bit like asking what limits a toddler has with crayons and a clean wall. Yes, in theory, there were rules. In practice, pure chaos. Let's begin with the law, because nothing sets the mood quite like dusty legal definitions. In Roman society, a slave wasn't considered a person. Legally, they were classified as res Latin for thing, not low-status worker, or a citizen with restricted rights. Just thing, the same category as a bench, an urn, or an anxious goat, and owners treated them accordingly. A master could beat a slave, sell them, rent them out, brand them, gamble them away, or pass them along as a gift like some unwanted Saturnalia fruit basket. Some were even sent to fight in the arena. And believe it or not, a few preferred that fate over folding laundry for a senator's wife with control issues. But despite this buffet of unchecked power, the Romans eventually realized that setting some limits might be useful. Not because they had a sudden wave of compassion, don't get carried away, but because killing off your workforce was exactly efficient. Dead slaves can't pour wine, pay taxes, or clean up after other dead slaves. So laws crept in awkwardly, like an uncle who shows up uninvited to a wedding. First, restrictions were vague, at best. For example, if a slave died under unclear circumstances, like repeatedly falling onto a sword 17 times, there might be a trial. Or maybe not. Depends on your connections. Hey, if you had enough influence, you could just shrug and claim he tripped during an intense dice game. Case closed. Eventually, emperors like Hadrian, the one with the famous wall, not the razor, decided it was time to clean things up. So introduced reforms stating that masters couldn't simply kill a slave on a whim. A reason was required. Of course, that reason was usually, he annoyed me. But still, it was a start. So yes, technically, there were a few things owners couldn't do. But those limits were buried under an avalanche of things they could. Roman law protected slaves the way an umbrella protects you during a hurricane, symbolically at best. In the early republic, killing a slave required no justification at all. Bad haircut, wrong glance, wine not cold enough, off with their head. And legally, it wasn't even murder after all. You can't murder property. By the time the empire matured around, when Romans were getting excited about indoor plumbing, things got more regulated. Not more humane, just more organized. Killing your own slave could now bring legal consequences. Not necessarily severe ones, but consequences nonetheless. Enter Emperor Hadrian, wall builder, lot weaker, and man who didn't want scandals with his breakfast. He issued an edict. Maybe Dante slaughtered the household staff, unless you cleared it with the proper authorities first. Owners now had to go through a magistrate to get official approval for executions, because nothing says justice like paperwork for homicide. Of course, enforcement was laughable. If you were wealthy and well-connected, magistrates didn't ask questions. If you weren't, congratulations. Your trial would be scheduled somewhere between a chariot race and the public's collective indifference. Still, on paper, it became illegal to kill a slave without formal authorization, which means that at some point, some very frazzled Roman lawyer had to look a client in the eye and say, no, you can't just crucify the cook because he burned the dormouse. It's not an immediate option anymore. This wasn't about kindness. It was about keeping the peace. Rome already knew what happened when enslaved people got pushed too far. Spartacus and his crew didn't exactly organize a polite garden party, so the government's thinking was simple. If cruelty couldn't be stopped, at least the kind of brutality that sparked uprisings could be curbed. You could still execute a slave, sure, but now it came with paperwork and the risk of your senatorial neighbor giving you the side eye at dinner. Murder wasn't outlawed, it was just politely discouraged, like applauding between symphony movements. That was Roman progress. Now, let's shift to a darker, more uncomfortable, but very important topic: how Roman masters handled the personal boundaries of enslaved people. Spoiler alert, they didn't. These were, after all, people who built public baths for hundreds and called it relaxation. Under Roman law, a slave wasn't recognized as a full legal person. That meant the concept of bodily autonomy didn't apply. Masters could assert themselves not just through forced labor, but in intimate, private ways, without needing consent, excuses, or even a moral rationale. The law didn't spell it out, because it didn't have to. Just as you wouldn't expect to find a statute forbidding someone from borrowing their own sandals, there was no regulation against a master demanding sexual access to an enslaved person. It was simply assumed, across society, as part of ownership. This affected all enslaved people, men, women, and especially the young, who were often valued as ornaments in elite households. Their appearance, charm, obedience were expected to entertain guests. Then that entertainment didn't always mean just music or wine service. Were there protections? Technically, yes, but only in terms of property rights. If someone else harmed your slave, you could sue them for damaging your property, not for violating the individual, but for decreasing the value of your asset. Roman courts cared far more about depreciation than dignity. Much later, particularly under the influence of Christianity, emperors began issuing vague moral codes promoting modesty. But these came late in the empire and were more about public image than genuine enforcement. They were essentially the legal version of sticking a fig leaf on a statue and calling it progress. In short, enslaved people in Rome had almost no protection from personal exploitation. It wasn't just tolerated, it was normalized. Even resisting abuse could result in harsher punishment than the abuse itself. Dark, yes, but essential to understand. Not to admire Rome, but to recognize what unchecked power looks like in its rawest form. Now, let's turn to marriage, the sacred bond of two souls, or, in Rome's case, careful blend of property arrangements, political strategy, and in-laws who might also happen to own gladiators. But what did this noble institution mean for slaves? Almost nothing. Legally, slaves couldn't marry. That doesn't mean they didn't fall in love, build households, or raise families. They did. In fact, some enslaved couples formed lifelong partnerships every bit as committed as a senator's fourth marriage, which, let's be honest, usually had more to do with inheritance than romance. But in Roman law, these unions weren't marriages. They were called contubernium, a term that sounds like an ointment, but actually described an unofficial domestic partnership. Think of it like common law marriage, stripped of the law, the rights, and the privacy. Owners could allow these unions, sometimes even encourage them, especially since children born of such relationships became new slaves, conveniently boosting the household workforce. A 2-for-1 deal with a built-in warranty. The catch: the master could dissolve the union at will. A couple could spend decades together, raise children, could still be split apart if one partner was sold to Sicily, while the other was sent to mop floors in Gaul. Did enslaved couples ever try to have their partnerships formally recognized? Occasionally, and in rare cases, if one or both partners were later freed. Their union might be retroactively acknowledged, like getting a marriage license years after the divorce. Touching, right? To complicate matters further, owners themselves could enter into contubernium with their slaves. Again, not true marriage, just a troubling blend of ownership, power imbalance, and what Romans might have called household convenience. Romantic tales, these were not. Imagine devoting 20 years to raising children, cleaning mosaics, and fetching grapes, only to hear your master refer to you as that tall one with the limp. Rude, yes, but that was Roman reality. In Rome, A slave-ass identity was as flexible as clay and a potter as hand sieve. The potter happened to be impatient, power-drunk, and allergic to surnames. While slaves did have names, they were usually assigned by masters, altered without warning, or erased completely. It was the ancient version of deleting your entire Google profile and replacing it with Steve Hash. 4. You might be born with a beautiful name, like Callista, most beautiful, but after being sold a couple of times, you might end up called Spatula because someone found it amusing. Unlike celebrities today, slaves couldn't reinvent themselves with a glamorous new identity. You got what you were given. Worse still, Roman society didn't recognize enslaved people as full humans, either legally or socially. They weren't defined by culture, heritage, or personal talent, but by utility. If you cooked, you were cooked. You were coked. If you managed accounts, dispensator. If you messed up the laundry once well, you were the idiot. A particularly gifted or educated slave, like a Greek philosopher turned tutor, might get to keep some respect hand, maybe even their original name. But don't get too comfortable. One wrong move, and you. KDB number 12. Roman satire even joked about households where every slave shared the same name for simplicity. Davos, bring the wine. 5 men would show up. One punished for slowness, the rest punished just in case. So could Roman masters strip away your name, history, and identity? Absolutely. Escaping slavery itself was hard, but escaping the nickname you got after sneezing on a senator was nearly impossible. And if you ever did win freedom, congratulations, you'd keep your former owner's family name, because nothing says liberty like being permanently branded with your master's identity. Picture a Roman villa, marble columns, a fountain shaped like a sea god vomiting water, and in the corner, a slave tutoring a senator's son in flawless Greek. Not every slave was out digging ditches or hauling lumber. Some were expected to dispense knowledge in carefully measured doses of dactylic hexameter. Education for slaves was one of Rome's strangest paradoxes. On paper, slaves were property, yet in practice, some were expected to be walking libraries fluent in multiple languages, skilled in philosophy, rhetoric, medicine, even law. But no, there wasn't extra page, just a slightly lower risk of being sold to someone worse. Greek slaves, in particular, were prized as teachers. Why? Because Rome was infatuated with Greece. They'd conquered it militarily, but culturally, they were enamored. Romans essentially said, "We've conquered you. Please make our children sound sophisticated at parties." A Greek slave might spend the day teaching bored teenagers Latin poetry, then be sent to fetch sandals at night. And don't mistake this for kindness. Educating slaves wasn't about generosity. It was about return on investment. An educated slave was a tool, one that could elevate a household as prestige or even earn money when loaned out. Education wasn't enlightenment, it was economics. Naturally, this created some uncomfortable power dynamics. Imagine being more educated than your master, yet still needing permission just to step outside. Many enslaved intellectuals lived on a tightrope, treated as experts, but ultimately regarded as living furniture. Could a slave pursue knowledge independently? In theory, yes, assuming they weren't too busy scrubbing floors or hired out to perform tricks at birthday feasts. But any self-improvement had to benefit the master. No one was handing out library cards to curious slaves. One famous example is Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher who taught resilience and virtue, while literally being someone else's property. That was Rome. Know thyself, but only if your owner allows it. Now we reach one of Rome's most tangled legal riddles. Could a slave sue their master? The answer is yes, about as much as a hamster could challenge its owner to chess. Technically possible, but not exactly realistic. Roman law, in its endless complexity, did carve out a few channels for complaints. One option was the jus supplicandi, the right to petition the emperor directly. A desperate slave could throw themselves at the feet of an imperial statue or plead before officials for intervention. A bold move, especially since the average slave wasn't carrying legal scrolls or versed in courtroom rhetoric. In practice, this was reserved for extreme cases, brutal beatings, sexual exploitation that went beyond even Rome's loose standards, or reckless neglect. If your master tried to set you on fire for forgetting the honeycakes, you might have a case. Forget to prune the hedge. Sorry, Decimus, you're out of luck. Another semi-legal route involved the aedus, magistrates who oversaw marketplaces and public order. Slaves, hired out for work scribes, cooks, entertainers, could sometimes file complaints against abusive temporary employers. But this was less about justice and more about preserving Rome's reputation as a city of dignity and order. If mistreatment embarrassed the empire, you had grounds. Otherwise, back to work. Then there was the notorious use verberant, the master's right to beat their slaves. A few emperors, including Hadrian, attempted to curb excessive cruelty, but excessive was subjective. If a slave died under torture, a judge might frown. If they were crippled for life, the reaction was usually a shrug. Still, in Rome's sprawling landscape of control, punishment, and legal red tape, there was one dusty glimmer of hope. Manumission, the act of being freed. Astonishingly, this was a right that even the harshest master couldn't erase. Sure, they could beat you, rename you Mopicus, or force you to serve wine at awkward banquets, but they couldn't eliminate the possibility of legal freedom once the path was open. Slaves could be freed in several ways: through a formal ceremony, via a master's will, or occasionally as a reward for exceptional service. It was like earning a gold star from your boss, except the prize was your entire life back. Of course, Rome loved regulation, so there were limits. You couldn't just free dozens at once. That would shake the social hierarchy. A master with 3 slaves could release only 2. A rule that felt less like justice and more like childhood. You can only bring 1 friend inside. You also couldn't manumit slaves if you were bankrupt or legally unfit, meaning enslaved people sometimes paid the price for their master's debts. And here's the twist. Once freed, a person became a libertus, or liberta. They weren't full citizens, but they could own property, make contracts, and yes, even own slaves themselves, an irony that felt like breaking out of prison only to build your own. Still, this legal mechanism gave enslaved people something their masters couldn't strip away: the right to hope. It might take decades of obedience, careful service, and perfectly folded tunics, but the possibility remained. And in Rome, sometimes the only thing you had was that fragile thread of hope, plus maybe a slightly less insulting nickname, if fortune was kind. At first glance, the Roman Republic looks like a place where slave owners could do whatever they pleased: slap, whip, rename you Bucketus, or sell you next to a donkey with better teeth. Standard practice, but killing a slave. That eventually became a line Rome decided shouldn't be crossed so casually. In the early days, the paterfamilias, the all-powerful male head of household, think dad, but legally Zeus, could execute a slave without so much as a form to fill out. Slaves were property, after all. You don't get arrested for smashing your own vase, even if that vase can bleed. Talk, and remember your bedtime stories. But as the empire grew and emperors realized slaves were the backbone of the economy, not to mention too valuable as tutors, bookkeepers, and barbers who ideally didn't cut throats, the laws began to shift. Under Hadrian, yes, the wall guy, masters were forbidden from killing their slaves without trial. Not out of compassion, but because it was bad economics. A dead slave didn't earn rental fees, trim hair, or amuse dinner guests. Later, Antoninus Pius went further, declaring that killing a slave without cause could be treated as murder. That's right, legal consequences. You couldn't just slaughter your cook for burning the garum sauce and expect applause. Now you might find yourself explaining things to a judge in public, with plenty of togas watching. This didn't suddenly transform slaveholders into tender-hearted saints, but it did carve out a strange legal middle ground. Slaves couldn't haul their owners into court for smacking them into next week. But if the master leaned too far into outright homicide, the authorities might step in. Why the shift? A mix of morals, finances, but mostly finances. Rome figured out that letting citizens destroy costly human property was terrible economics. Think of it as the empire's version of HR training. In Rome, if you were a freeborn citizen with a slave, there was one thing the law specifically blocked you from doing: marrying them. That's right, you could order them to wash your back, name your kids, or even polish your verses. But a legal wedding, it's outrageous. Marriage, or connubium, was a civic right reserved for free individuals. Since slaves were legally categorized as possessions, like a plow or an overworked mule, they couldn't qualify for society's formal unions. No vows, no family feasts, and definitely no cozy retreats in Pompeii. But this was Rome, land of loopholes. So while official matrimony was forbidden, owners could form a kind of unofficial partnership with their slaves, particularly if said slave was charming, talented, or excellent at refilling goblets. These arrangements were so common they had a name: contubernium, literally tent sharing. It sounded like a camping trip, but in practice it meant a long-term domestic relationship with skewed power dynamics. The slave remained property, but could live with the master, raise children, and essentially fill the role of spouse minus legal standing. The children, if their mother was enslaved, they, too, were slaves. It's quite the generational trap. If a master truly cared, worried about public image, or wanted to sort out inheritance rights, he could always free the slave first and then marry them. A bureaucratic workaround, of course. This meant paperwork, manumission costs, and probably a painfully awkward moment at the next elite banquet. Gaius married his maid. No, after freeing her. Very respectable. She's Julia something now. In a status-obsessed culture, wedding a former slave was risky. It could draw mockery. But legally, once freed, she was eligible. Even the sharpest slave in Rome, fluent in Greek, brilliant with accounts, able to recite Cicero backwards while juggling figs, could never run for public office. Not even the dull ones like lamppost inspector. Because slaves, though central to society, weren't treated as full human beings under the law. They were more like sturdy, multilingual furniture, and Roman politics, with its fixation on dignitas honor, demanded freeborn men from families untainted by purchase. So masters couldn't plop their brightest slave into the Senate, no matter how many times they out-argued some patrician who thought the Punic Wars were still raging. The rule was simple: public office was for the free. While slaves often managed estates, wrote speeches, or even ran finances for their masters, they could never wear the title themselves. Even freedmen, former slaves, remained barred from the highest ranks. They could buy land, run shops, and wear nicer tunics, but suspicion followed them. Meanwhile, wealthy Romans leaned heavily on enslaved brains. Need an oration. Your Greek slave had it. Need the library sorted. Your copyist handled it. Need a bribe, managed quietly. Who better than someone legally invisible? Yet, no matter how talented, the enslaved themselves stayed locked out of official recognition. Rome preferred them as the hidden intellect behind the curtain, not the face on stage. As for testimony, don't imagine Roman courts politely asking a slave to describe what they saw at dinner. Slaves weren't allowed to give sworn evidence, unless it was under torture. Jurists assumed an enslaved person would always lie to protect their master. So instead of relying on trust, they turned to whips, irons, and other painful truth enhancers. This created a bizarre contradiction. A slave couldn't testify for their master because it seemed biased, and if they tried, it was doubted anyway. So the solution: extract statements with pain. Justice, Roman style. Exceptions existed, sometimes freedmen or slaves testifying in cases not tied to their masters, but generally. The assumption was always, they'll lie unless we hurt them. It was cruel and inconsistent. Imagine building a case when your main witness can only speak mid-scream. It's like expecting a parrot to sing the anthem while being zapped. She'll get noise, but not justice. In practice, owners couldn't demand court testimony from their slaves unless the state handled the torturing itself, oddly seen as impartial procedure. For Rome, Lady Justice didn't wear a blindfold. She just preferred her witnesses bruised. Yet, even in this system, slaves had surprising economic wiggle room. They might be treated like animated furniture, but often had the chance to run small ventures or earn extra income on the side. It's the paradox. Legally owned, but with pockets of independence. Slaves could gather personal funds, called a peculium basically, an unofficial allowance tip jar, or under-the-bed stash, that, legally, still belonged to the master, but was often left alone as long as the slave wasn't. Spending it on an uprising or a luxury bath. And here's where things got amusingly awkward for Rome's control-obsessed elite. Slaves could actually use this peculium to purchase their own freedom. Yes, they could pay their owner to stop owning them, okay? Picture working full-time for someone who locks you in the basement, then handing them your salary to kindly unlock the door. Greetings, master. I've saved up from errands and surviving. I'd prefer not to be your property anymore. Here's the payment. Now, was this a guaranteed right? Not really. Roman law didn't force owners to accept, and a particularly stubborn master could refuse if he felt mean or enjoyed barking commands. But many agreed, since it made them look generous and got them paid. This created a strange balance. Owners couldn't forbid a slave from saving money as long as it came from legitimate work. Nor could they just grab the peculium without seeming dishonorable. And in Roman culture, looking dishonorable was worse than taking a minor stab wound. Some slaves even managed estates, oversaw finances, or ran shops, often knowing more about trade than their masters, who were too busy lounging in togas and misquoting Virgil. Sure, a master could take back the peculium at any time. Doing it too often made them look miserly, like someone who swipes coins from the tip bowl. So most resisted. In the end, masters held nearly all the power, but clever slaves could still quietly build their own leverage. If you thought Rome gave owners total control over every part of a slave's existence, it'd be almost re-accept when it came to faith. Because even in a society where a man could rename his dog Caesar and sell the same slave 3 times for tax tricks, there were boundaries. One was this: a master couldn't completely bar a slave from religious rites, especially those tied to the household spirits. These weren't grand gods like Jupiter or Mars hogging statues and lightning bolts. They were modest, domestic guardians. Think divine smoke detectors, keeping the home safe and the hearth from burning down. Every household shrine included them, and even slaves were expected, sometimes required, to take part in the rituals, lighting incense, saying a prayer, offering food, basic, please keep the house standing today gestures. To stop a slave from this would seemed bizarre, okay? Like forbidding someone from singing happy birthday at their own party. Religion in Rome was as much about appearances and tradition as faith. Having slaves join in made the household look orderly, pious, and not cursed. And honestly, even harsh masters weren't eager to annoy the family gods. These spirits were believed to watch you eat, sleep, and scold your accountant. Not worth risking supernatural nitpicking just to prove a point. Some slaves even had their own small spirits, larvals, with tiny rituals attached. It was one of the rare spaces in Roman life where a slave could express identity, at least ward off another plumbing disaster. So while an owner could control most of a slave's work and body, when it came to appeasing divine roommates, they usually backed off. In Rome, even gods respected professional boundaries for all their influence, prestige, and unsettlingly large profiles on coins. Roman masters had one big weakness: public shame. In Rome, dignitas honor, reputation. The image of being a proper toga wearer was worth more than wealth, livestock, or battlefield glory combined. And nothing shattered that social armor faster than a scandal involving the very people scrubbing your latrine. This meant that, legal or not, there were things owners simply avoided, not out of sudden compassion, but because Romans were viciously judgmental. The mob, the Senate, even your dinner guests could end your career faster than an untimely vomitorium accident. For example, when a noble punished his entire staff of slaves for one person's crime, it was technically lawful, but public outrage was so strong the Senate considered restrictions on such overreach. Forum gossip, the Roman version of Twitter, erupted. And then there was infamia, the legal and social stain marking anyone seen as too cruel, greedy, or shameless. If you became known as the guy who flogged his slaves for botching Latin, your name sank lower than a disgraced charioteerand with fewer admirers. Strangely enough, gaining a reputation as a merciful or kind master turned into its own kind of status symbol. Masters would stage acts of kindness, freeing a slave in public, granting a peculi, letting one marry just to show off their moral compass, which was usually spinning like a drunken centurion. The Mongol Empire. A Khan's harem was never just a private collection of lovers, okay? It was a living emblem of empire. Imagine a vast tent complex or palace chamber filled with women from every corner of Eurasia, each chosen not only for beauty, but for what her presence represented. To the Mongols, concubines were as much about politics as they were about pleasure. They were walking trophies of conquest, tangible reminders that the Khan's authority reached far beyond the steppes. A harem could contain dozens, sometimes even hundreds of women, ranging from noble daughters of rival rulers to slaves captured during raids. Each arrival sent a message. If the Khan had the daughter of a Persian prince or a Chinese governor in his court, it wasn't just about companionship. It was a declaration of dominance. It meant the Mongols didn't simply defeat armies, okay? They absorbed their enemies into their households, their bloodlines, even their future dynasties. This wasn't unique to the Mongols. Many empires kept harems. The scale and symbolism here were unmatched. 4 nomadic rulers who built legitimacy not on palaces or marble cities, but on conquest and charisma. The harem was a portable display of prestige to foreign ambassadors. Walking into the Khan's court and seeing women from their homeland seated among others was both awe-inspiring and humiliating. It was a reminder that the king could command loyalty, tribute, and even intimacy from lands thousands of miles away. Concubines also blurred the line between politics and family. Some women faded into anonymity, living quiet lives within the harem walls, but others rose to prominence, wielding influence through charm, cunning, or motherhood. A concubine who bore a son could see her fortunes transformed overnight, her child potentially standing in line for succession. In this way, harems became miniature political arenas with rivalries, alliances, and betrayals unfolding as intensely as they did on the battlefield. For the Mongols, war was not only about territory, it was about reshaping societies down to the bodies of the people they conquered. When the horsemen thundered into Persia, Russia, or northern China, they didn't just take gold, livestock, and prisoners of war. They also selected women, sometimes by the dozens, sometimes by the hundreds, who would be swept into the Khan's harem. To the Mongols, the capture of women was more than a spoil of war. It was an instrument of domination. Take, for instance, the campaigns of Genghis Khan. After defeating rival tribes, he made a point of claiming high-born women for himself and his family. These weren't random abductions. They were deliberate choices. A princess from a rival clan wasn't simply beautiful. She was a piece of political leverage. By sleeping under the same roof as the Khan, she ensured that her lineage was absorbed symbolically and sometimes literally into the Mongol world order. It was a brutal kind of diplomacy, one that mixed conquest with forced intimacy. But capture didn't always mean elevation. For every noblewoman taken as a concubine, countless others, peasants, servants, slaves, were swept into the lower ranks of the harem. Some were destined for lives of obscurity, their names never recorded, their their roles reduced to the endless cycle of serving, entertaining, and being forgotten. To them, conquest meant the erasure of identity, replaced by the anonymity of being one among many. Still, the presence of these women reinforced the empire's reach. A harem in Karakoram, or later in Beijing, could resemble a living map of Mongol victories. You might see a Turk beauty from Samarkand, a Sankorsha from Hio, a Russian captive from Ryazan, and a Persian noble from Isfahan, all seated in the same hall, speaking different languages, bound by the same fate. Each one was proof that no wall, city, or dynasty was beyond Mongol power. And yet, amidst this brutality, opportunity sometimes flickered. Concubine with intelligence and ambition could rise above her station, catching the Khan's eye and securing influence for herself or her family. Conquest created victims, yes, but it also created unlikely players in the grand game of empire. The harem was not just a prison. In rare cases, it was a ladder, albeit one built from violence and subjugation. Not every woman in the Mongol harems was taken by force. Sometimes they arrived wrapped in silks, accompanied by servants, and presented like jewels in a box. These were the daughters and sisters of kings, governors, and co-survival over resistance. Sending a woman to the Mongol court was a grim but practical form of diplomacy, one that often meant the difference between keeping a throne and watching it burn. For rulers facing the unstoppable cavalry, tribute wasn't just gold or horses. A daughter could be the ultimate peace offering, a human shield against the wrath of Mongol armies. Imagine the scene. An envoy entering the court of Ogadai or Kubla, bowing low and offering the most prized possession of his household, a royal woman dressed to display her wealth and heritage, the Tej. In that moment, she became both a hostage and a bridge, a living treaty that tied her homeland to the empire's will. The Mongols understood the weight of such gestures. Concubine given as tribute wasn't just a wife or servant. She was proof that another ruler accepted Mongol supremacy. Kang could look across his harem and literally see the submission of nations. Each woman carried the story of her people's survival or their surrender. But here's the cruel irony. While some women wielded quiet diplomatic significance, they were still bound by the harem's hierarchy. Kai, princess from a powerful kingdom, might enjoy privileges, fine clothing, and a voice in court affairs, but her life was not her own. Her presence reminded her homeland of its vulnerability and a delicate balance of loyalty it owed to the Mongol throne. At times, these women even acted as informal ambassadors through letters, gifts, and whispered influence. They maintained contact with their families, subtly steering diplomacy from behind veils and screens. Some used their positions to protect their people, bargaining for lighter tribute demands or leniency during rebellions. Others became pawns used as leverage when their kin failed to deliver on promises. Tribute through women was the perfect combination of symbolism and pragmatism for the Mongols. It reinforced their dominance without shedding a drop of blood, and for the rulers who sent them, it was both a humiliation and a desperate hope that by sacrificing one daughter, they might save an entire kingdom. Behind the walls of the Mongol harem, life unfolded in ways both lavish and suffocating. These were not simple households, but sprawling, tightly organized institutions. The harem might be physically located in a tent complex on the steppe, or inside a palace in cities like Karakoram or later Kabalik. Yet, the atmosphere was always the same, layered with rules, rituals, and rivalries. Women were ranked according to origin and favor. At the top stood royal consorts, often wives taken through formal marriage alliances. Below them came high-born concubines, often daughters of defeated rulers or tribute princesses. At the bottom were the nameless masses, slaves, entertainers, and servants swept up during raids. Every woman knew her position, and every woman knew that it could change. sometimes with a single glance from the Khayan. Daily life was a paradox. On one hand, there was luxury. Silks from China, jewels from Persia, perfumes from India. Meals were rich with game, dairy, and exotic imports. The harem itself was often guarded by eunuchs or loyal retainers, ensuring both security and secrecy. Yet, beneath the glitter, life could feel like gilded captivity. Women lived cut off from the outside world, their movements controlled, their futures dependent on the Khan's whims. Still, this cloistered environment was far from quiet. The harem was its own political battleground. It's a concubine scheme to catch the Khan's attention, forging alliances with servants or undermining rivals with whispered rumors. A concubine who bore a son suddenly found herself propelled into a higher status. Her child might even be groomed for leadership. On the other hand, a woman who fell from favor could vanish into obscurity, her name erased from court records. Yet, not all influence came through seduction or children. Some women wielded power through intellect, charm, or sheer resilience. Tay advised, listened, and sometimes manipulated, turning the harem into a subtle arena of diplomacy. From behind veils, they could influence decisions that affected kingdoms, military campaigns, or the succession itself. For outsiders, the harem remained a world of mystery filled with both opulence and danger. For those inside, it was a delicate game of survival. To thrive meant mastering silence, patience, and strategy. In many ways, life in the Mongol harem mirrored the empire itself. Ruthless, expansive, and always balanced on the edge of opportunity and ruin. The battlefield was where Mongol generals clashed. The harem was where their concubines waged silent wars of their own. Within its walls, rivalries simmered, alliances formed, and whispers often carried more weight than swords. A single smile from the Khayan could spark jealousy, while a passing insult might spiral into years of quiet scheming. At the core of these rivalries was status. To be favored by the Khayan meant better quarters, finer clothes, and most importantly, influence. Concubines competed not only for affection, but also for the chance to secure a future for their children. A son born of a favored concubine could one day become a prince or even a Khan. That possibility alone turned every birth into a high-stakes event and every pregnancy into a battle with consequences stretching across the empire. But ambition in the harem wasn't limited to motherhood. Some women sought to build alliances with the Nux guards or senior wives, leveraging these connections for survival or advantage. Others mastered the subtle art of information, knowing which rival had lost favor, which envoy had sent gifts, or which servant could be bribed to deliver a message at just the right moment. In a world where voices were often ignored, knowledge was a currency far more valuable than silver. Yet, these intrigues could also be deadly. A whisper of betrayal, a rumor of infidelity, or an accusation of witchcraft could destroy a concubine standing overnight. History hints at women who mysteriously disappeared, their fates unrecorded, likely victims of palace politics. To outsiders, the harem seemed like a paradise of beauty and luxury. To those within, it could feel like a chessboard where every move had to be calculated and every misstep could mean ruin. What makes these rivalries fascinating is that they mirrored the empire's larger struggles, cues, as Mongol princes vied for succession and generals plotted their next campaign. The concubines maneuvered within their confined world for influence, security, and recognition. Their rivalries weren't just petty squabbles. They were reflections of the Mongol court itself, condensed into the lives of women forced to play the game of survival with stakes as high as any battlefield. In this sense, the harem was not merely a private space. It was an echo chamber of the empire's politics, where intrigue thrived and rivalries shaped destinies. If concubinage was a game of chance, then motherhood was the ultimate jackpot. In the Mongol Empire, bearing a son didn't just elevate a concubine's rank, it transformed her into a power broker. The moment a child cried within the harem walls, the woman who gave birth could rise overnight from relative obscurity to a position of genuine influence. Mongol politics revolved heavily around bloodlines, and every Khagan was deeply invested in producing heirs. Official wives often held seniority, but concubines who bore sons could rival them in authority. A single birth could tilt the balance of succession, fueling rivalries that extended beyond the harem into the court and battlefield. Suddenly, generals, ministers, and even foreign envoys had to pay attention to a woman who, just weeks earlier, might have been overlooked. Mothers of princes had unique responsibilities. They were expected to oversee their child's upbringing, ensure loyalty among servants, and sometimes even act as political advisors. While a boy was raised in the warrior traditions of the steppe, his mother remained the guardian of his early education, shaping his values and allegiances. Some concubines became fierce advocates for their sons, maneuvering to secure lands, armies, and titles for them. But the stakes were brutally high. If a concubine's son failed, was sidelined, or lost the succession battle, both mother and child could face ruin, or worse. The Mongol Empire was infamous for its violent succession struggles, with princes clashing in bloody conflicts that tore families apart. For the women who bore them, survival meant not only protecting their child, but also navigating the vicious rivalries between competing mothers. Some mothers achieved lasting power. Historical whispers suggest that certain concubines became kingmakers, influencing which son was chosen as heir. Through whispers, gifts, and quiet persuasion, they could shape the destiny of the empire itself. Others faded into obscurity once their sons died young or failed to claim a place among the ruling elite. In the Mongol harem, to be a mother was both a blessing and a curse. It offered the only real path to influence for most concubines, yet it tied their fate entirely to a child's success. In a world where princes lived with daggers at their backs, motherhood was as much a gamble as it was a triumph. Concubines in the Mongol Empire weren't just women living behind veils and walls. They were symbols, carefully curated pieces of propaganda that reinforced the Khan's supremacy. Every concubine represented a story, the capture of a city, the submission of a rival, or the survival of a diplomatic treaty. To look at a Mongol harem was to see the empire itself reflected in human form. Imagine the scene. A court gathering where foreign envoys entered the Khan's palace. They were led past rooms filled with women of unmistakably different origins: Turk, Chinese, Persian, Russian, Korean. Each bore the distinct marks of her homeland: embroidered robes, jewels shaped in regional styles, or hairstyles that spoke of far-off traditions. To the Mongols, this diversity was not chaos, but proof that their authority spanned continents. The harem was a living atlas, each woman a pin on the map of conquest. This symbolism worked on multiple levels. Domestically, it reminded Mongol nobles of the Khan's unmatched power. He commanded not only men and armies, but also the beauty and bloodlines of conquered peoples. For foreign diplomats, the message was even sharper. Your land may still exist, but your daughters are here. The Khan doesn't just rule territories. He rules families, futures, and dynasties. The presence of concubines also reinforced the Mongol image of themselves as world rulers, chosen by the eternal blue sky. Just as the empire absorbed craftsmen, scholars, and generals from all corners of Eurasia, so too did it absorb women. The harem was not an indulgence. It was a microcosm of universal rule, echoing the belief that the Mongols were destined to govern the entire world. Of course, this symbolism weighed heavily on the women themselves. Many were stripped of their identities, renamed and refashioned into ornaments of empire. Yet, for some, that role came with opportunities. Concubine might subtly leverage her position as a representative of her homeland, advocating for her people or shaping policies in their favor. In this way, the harem became both a prison and a stage where women played unwilling but crucial roles in empire building. Concubines were never mere companions. They were living trophies, symbols of conquest, and reminders of the Mongols' relentless hunger for domination. In their faces, the world could see the cost of empire. For every concubine who rose to prominence, dozens more slipped quietly into obscurity. The Mongol harems were vast, sometimes housing hundreds of women, and most lived their lives unseen by history. Their names were rarely recorded, their faces forgotten, their stories erased by the sheer scale of empire. For these women, survival, not influence, was the highest achievement. Life for the lesser concubines was marked by routine and invisibility. They performed tasks within the harem, sewing, weaving, preparing food, or entertaining through music and dance. Many never saw the Khin beyond a distant glimpse, let alone shared his bed. For them, the grandeur of the harem was less about opulence and more about monotony. Days blended together, punctuated only by the small dramas of rivalry, illness, or the occasional promotion when a favored concubine fell from grace. Yet, obscurity was often safer than ambition. To strive for influence meant attracting enemies, and in the harem, enemies could be fatal. Rumors of witchcraft, disloyalty, or disrespect could condemn a woman to exile or worse. In contrast, those who kept their heads down, who blended into the background, often endured long lives within the harem's protective walls. Their anonymity was a shield against the dangers of intrigue. Still, survival carried its own costs. These women were uprooted from their homelands, stripped of their languages and traditions, and remade into silent fixtures of the Mongol court. They lived lives disconnected from their families, knowing they would never return to their native lands. For some, the memory of home faded into fragments. A lullaby half remembered, a recipe long forgotten, a childhood story they could no longer tell in their original tongue. And yet, survival in itself was a victory. The Mongol Empire was an unforgiving world, filled with brutal campaigns and ruthless politics. Concubine who lived quietly in the harem outlasted soldiers, generals, and even princes who perished in endless wars. While history ignored them, these women carried the resilience of endurance. Their lives remind us that not all history is written in bold strokes of conquest and power. Sometimes it is written in silence, in the quiet persistence of those who endured without leaving their names behind. In the shadow of empire, survival was its own kind of triumph. The story of concubinage in the Mongol Empire is not just a tale of luxury or intrigue. It is a mirror reflecting the very mechanics of empire, how power was displayed, how politics were negotiated, and how women became both pawns and players in a world dominated by conquest. For the Khin, concubines were more than companions. They were symbols of legitimacy, tokens of diplomacy, and proof that no kingdom or people could resist Mongol will. The harem, filled with women from across Eurasia, was a living monument, one that told every visitor, this empire stretches farther than you can imagine. In this sense, the practice of concubinage shaped the image of Mongol rule as universal, destined, and unstoppable. For the women themselves, however, the legacy was complex. Some concubines rose to prominence, shaping dynastic succession and influencing imperial policy. Their children became princes, generals, and heirs to thrones. These women, often forgotten by name, quietly steered the fate of the empire through their proximity to power. Yet for every woman who found influence, countless others endured lives of obscurity, their voices lost in the shadows of the harem. What lingers is the duality of their existence, symbols and survivors, political tools and human beings. They remind us that history is not only written by generals and but also by those who lived within their orbits. Even when unnamed concubines embodied the empire's ambitions and bore the hidden costs of its expansion. The practice of concubinage also left echoes that stretched beyond the Mongols. Later dynasties in China, Persia, and Central Asia adopted or expanded harem systems that owed much to Mongol precedent. The idea of women as instruments of power, as both spoils and guarantors of political order, became woven into the political culture of Eurasia long after the empire itself dissolved. Ultimately, concubinage in the Mongol Empire forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Behind the grandeur of conquest were lives shaped by captivity, ambition, and survival. The cane rode across continents, reshaping the world. But the women in their harems carried that story in their bodies, in their silence. They were the human cost of empire and its most enduring symbols. Step into Victorian London, and the first thing you notice isn't the grandeur of its architecture, or even the smog that hung over the city. It's the food, smells. Every major street, alley, and marketplace doubled as a kitchen. Food wasn't confined to pubs or gentle tea rooms. Spilled out into the streets, carried on carts with squeaky wheels, balanced in baskets on the arms of hawkers, and sizzling over small charcoal braziers right on the pavement. For working-class Londoners who rarely had access to their own ovens, this street economy was a lifeline. Most households in the slums didn't have the luxury of a full kitchen. Even boiling water could be a struggle. Street food filled that gap. Few pennies could buy a hot, filling meal that spared families the need to cook in cramped, smoke-choked rooms. To eat from the street was not a treat. It was a necessity. The streets themselves became theaters of food. Hawkers shouted rhymes and catchy cries to draw customers. Hot pies, all hot, or chestnuts, all warm. These weren't just sales pitches. They were part of the city's soundtrack, mingling with horse hooves, factory whistles, and the hum of thousands moving through London's arteries. To walk down Cheapside, Whitechapel, or the Strand was to pass through a symphony of smells and sounds, each hawker vying for attention. But there was another side to this bustling kitchen, hygiene, or rather, the lack of it. Food was often prepared in bulk under questionable conditions, carried in open baskets, or set out on stalls where cold, soot, and flies had free rein. Still, for many Londoners, the choice wasn't between clean and dirty. It was between eating something questionable or going hungry. At its core, Victorian street food culture reflected the rhythms of the city itself. It was fast, cheap, loud, and always within reach. From the dock worker grabbing a meat pie, between shifts to children pooling coins for a shared bag of roasted potatoes, the streets provided what kitchens could not. In a society stratified by wealth and class, the food hawkers of London blurred the lines, feeding everyone who had a penny to spare. The streets weren't just a place to walk. They were where the city ate. If there was one undisputed monarch of Victorian street food, it was the hot pie. To the weary laborer trudging home from a 10-hour shift, or the clerk hurrying down the Strand, nothing satisfied hunger faster or cheaper than a steaming pie pulled, fresh from a hawker's portable oven. These pies weren't dainty pastries fit for drawing rooms. They were sturdy handheld meals designed for one thing: survival on the go. The pies came in every imaginable form. Meat pies were the standard, though meat could be a generous term. Some were stuffed with minced beef or mutton, but cheaper versions often used scraps of gristle, offal, or even questionable fillers padded out with potatoes or turnips. For a penny, you didn't ask too many questions. You just hoped for something warm and filling. Customers might buy a V, an oyster pie, a delicacy that combined luxury with affordability, showing how street food could cater to both the working poor and the upwardly mobile middle class. Street pie sellers were everywhere, wheeling around tin ovens that kept their wares hot. These contraptions looked like miniature fireplaces on wheels, smoke curling up as the hawker cried out, pies all hot, piping hot. The cries became part of London's identity, instantly recognizable to anyone navigating the city's crowded lanes. Some sellers even built loyal followings, known by name and trusted for their pie's relative quality compared to less reputable competitors. But for all their popularity, hot pies also had a darker reputation. Reformers and journalists frequently raised alarms about food adulteration in Victorian London. Pies were often at the center of suspicion. The press loved horror stories of cat or dog meat finding its way into fillings, playing into anxieties about the city's murky food supply. While many such tales were exaggerated, they revealed the tension between the joy of a warm meal and the uncertainty of what exactly one was eating. Still, the hot pie endured because it met the needs of the age. In a city exploding with people, factories, and long hours, the pie was portable, hearty, and cheap. It wasn't fine dining, but it was democratic, a meal that filled bellies and fueled the Victorian workforce. In many ways, it was the quintessential taste of London's streets. If hot pies reigned supreme year-round, roasted chestnuts claimed their own seasonal crown in Victorian London. As the day shortened and the fog thickened, the sharp, smoky scent of chestnuts roasting over open braziers drifted through the streets. It was the smell of winter in the city, wrapping itself around pedestrians like an edible perfume. Chestnut sellers set up on corners and busy thoroughfares, their simple stalls marked by little iron pans or braziers glowing with hot coals. For a penny, you could walk away with a warm paper cone filled with chestnuts, their shells charred, their flesh soft and nutty. For poor Londoners with numb fingers and empty stomachs, the chestnut wasn't just food, it was heat. Customers warmed their hands on the cone before eating, a small but precious comfort in the damp, bone-chilling cold of Victorian winters. The trade itself was often run by the very poor, many of them women and children. For some, selling chestnuts was the only barrier between their families and starvation. It required little equipment, just a brazier, fuel, and a supply of nuts, and could be operated anywhere crowds gathered. Railway stations, markets, and theater districts were prime spots with sellers catching customers as they poured out of evening shows. Chestnuts also carried a reputation as one of the safer street foods. Unlike pies, which could hide anything within their crust, chestnuts were roasted in their shells, right before your eyes. They didn't require complicated storage, and they were hard to adulterate. Reformers who railed against food impurities sometimes held up chestnuts as an example of honest street fare, simple, clean, and nourishing. Yet, even here, there were hints of hardship. Sellers often worked long hours in freezing weather, their faces smudged with coal dust, their hands calloused from handling hot pans. For customers, the warm cone was fleeting comfort. For sellers, it was survival, one penny at a time. The popularity of roasted chestnuts was such that they became part of Victorian literature and art. Charles Dickens himself immortalized them, describing how their aroma filled London's wintry streets. More than just a snack, they symbolized the shared humanity of the city. A food cheap enough for the poor, yet fragrant and festive enough to be enjoyed by the middle classes. In a city defined by inequality, roasted chestnuts were one of the few treats that crossed all social boundaries. If roasted chestnuts carried the charm of winter evenings, then Ills stalls embodied the grit of working-class London. For the city's poorest residents, Ills weren't just another street snack. They were survival food, cheap and endlessly available. With the Thames teaming with the slippery creatures, eels became one of the most democratic staples of Victorian street cuisine. Aisle sellers set up rough wooden stalls or operated from carts, displaying trays of the wriggling fish, sometimes still alive, sometimes already chopped into sections and stewing in large iron pots. For a few pennies, a hungry laborer could buy a serving of jellied eels, boiled until their natural gelatin set into a wobbly, glistening mass. For those with a stronger stomach, stewed eels simmered in pepper and vinegar offered a richer, more savory taste. Either way, they provided protein at a price no butcher could match. The stalls themselves were magnets for the working poor. Dock workers, factory hands, and costermongers crowded around them, scooping up portions eaten, standing, or carried home in little basins. Unlike pies or chestnuts, which were snacks, eels were a meal, cheap, filling, and sustaining enough to carry a man through another exhausting day. But eel stalls weren't just about food. They were social spaces. Men and women rubbed shoulders here, exchanging gossip, news, or jokes while spooning down their bowls. A tia was heavy with the tang of vinegar, the bubbling sound of pots, and the cries of hawkers shouting prices. In a city where class divisions cut deep, eel stalls were one of the few places where poverty was openly visible, yet communal, where survival had its own camaraderie. The popularity of eel stalls also reflected the precariousness of Victorian diets. Meat was expensive, bread was often adulterated with chalk or alum, and vegetables could be scarce in poor neighborhoods. Eels filled the gap, offering nourishment where other foods failed. Their abundance in the Thames kept costs low, though fishing and pollution would later tarnish this abundance. To outsiders, eel stalls may have seemed unappealing, even grotesque. But to countless Londoners, they were lifelines, offering not just calories, but community. In many ways, they defined the very essence of Victorian street food: practical, affordable, and unapologetically tied to the rhythms of survival. Pot pies and eels fed the stomach. Penny ice creams and sugary street snacks fed the soul. By the mid-9th century, London streets rang not only with the cries of savory food hawkers, but also with the cheerful calls of sellers promising a moment of sweetness for just a copper coin. For children and adults alike, these streets offered a brief escape from the grind of daily life. The most famous indulgence was penny ice cream. Long before refrigeration was common, street vendors carried ice mixed with saltpeter to keep their confections cold. Ice cream was scooped into small, reusable glasses, sometimes rinsed only briefly before being handed to the next eager customer. It wasn't luxurious Italian gelato, but for a penny, Londoners didn't complain. Flavors ranged from lemon and strawberry. Two questionable mixtures of milk and sugar syrup churned into something resembling ice cream. Despite its dubious hygiene, penny ice was wildly popular, especially in summer when it turned crowded streets into impromptu carnivals. But ice cream was far from the only sweet treat on offer. Hawkers sold toffee drops, trickle sticks, candied nuts, and sticks of peppermint rock. Licorice roots were chewed by children whose parents couldn't spare more than a half penny. Vendors with trays strapped to their shoulders wove through busy streets, jingling bells or shouting sing-on cries to announce their presence. The sight of children pressing their noses against trays of sweets became a familiar image in the city. These sugary snacks carried a powerful symbolism in Victorian London. For the poor, they were luxuries within reach, tiny indulgences that made deprivation easier to bear. For reformers, however, there were signs of moral decay, tempting children with cheap pleasures and distracting them from thrift and discipline. Newspapers occasionally published warnings about adulterated candies colored with poisonous dyes, adding another layer of anxiety to the sweet trade. Yet, the popularity of penny ice creams and sugary snacks persisted because they spoke to something deeper than hunger. They offered joy, however fleeting, for neighborhoods where children worked as street sellers themselves. Hawking matches or newspapers, a penny spent on ice cream was not just about taste, it was about childhood, in a city that often denied them one. Sugary treats may not have been nourishing, but they were essential in another way. They fed hope, delight, and the human craving for small pleasures amid hardship. Street food in Victorian London wasn't only about eating, it was about drinking too. Alongside the cries of pie sellers and the hiss of roasting chestnuts came the clinking of bottles and the steam rising from kettles. Beverages were an essential part of street culture, offering refreshment, warmth, or in some cases, a cheap buzz. One of the most popular drinks was ginger beer. Unlike modern sodas, Victorian ginger beer was often fermented, meaning it carried a mild alcoholic kick. Sold in sturdy stoneware bottles with cork stoppers, it was tangy, fizzy, and just sweet enough to appeal to children and adults alike. Sold it from carts or shops that specialized in nothing but this spicy brew. For the working poor, ginger beer offered a refreshing alternative to water, which was often unsafe to drink. Its effervescence made it feel indulgent, even if it was only a penny a glass. Coffee stalls were another defining feature of the Victorian street scene. They appeared on corners before dawn, catering to laborers heading to factories and dockyards. These stalls were simple setups, usually a handcart with a brass urn perched on top, steam wafting into the morning air. For a halfpenny or a penny, a blurry-eyed worker could buy a cup of coffee, often heavily watered down and sweetened with molasses. It wasn't cafe quality, but it was hot, and in the freezing fog of London mornings, that was more important than taste. Alongside coffee, stalls often sold bread rolls, boiled eggs, or slices of cake, making them a kind of early fast food breakfast spot. Their convenience made them hugely popular, especially among the city's growing population of night shift workers who needed sustenance at odd hours. Stalls blurred the line between necessity and indulgence, providing affordable comfort in a city that rarely paused. Critics, of course, sniffed at both ginger beer and coffee stalls. Reformers worried about the alcohol content of ginger beer leading children astray, while moralists threatened that lingering at coffee stalls encouraged idleness or even petty crime. Yet, their popularity never waned. For many Londoners, these beverages weren't luxuries. They were part of the daily rhythm of survival. In the clamor of Victorian streets, drinks on the go gave the city its pulse, sharp, hot, fizzy, and endlessly flowing. If you closed your eyes in Victorian London, you could still tell where you were. Not from the clatter of carriage wheels or the foghorns on the Thames, but from the voices of the street vendors. Their cries were the soundtrack of the city, cutting through the fog and coal smoke, announcing food with rhymes, songs, and shouts that were as distinctive as the flavors they sold. Vendors competed fiercely for attention. A pie seller might bellow, "Pisces, all hot, piping hot," while a chestnut hawker sang out in Sangal, "Chestnuts, all warm and ready." These weren't just advertisements. They were performances honed over years until the very sound became associated with the food. Londoners didn't just hear words. They heard melodies that stirred. Hunger, children would rush toward the familiar cry of the ice cream man, while tired workers perked up at the booming call of the coffee stall keeper. Each vendor had their own style. Some used humor, poking fun at customers or rivals. Others relied on rhythm, repeating phrases like chants until they echoed across alleyways. The best-known cries became cultural markers noted in newspapers, novels, and even parodies on the music hall stage. Charles Dickens himself often wrote of these cries, understanding that they were inseparable from the city's identity. For the vendors, the cries were survival tools. Competition on crowded streets was brutal, and without a loud, memorable call, a seller could easily be drowned out. A sharp, catchy cry could mean the difference between going home with a pocket of coins or with spoiled goods. Some vendors even hired children to call for them, their high-pitched voices cutting through the din better than adult ones. But the cries were more than business. They created community. Neighbors came to recognize the same vendors passing through at certain times of day, their voices marking the rhythm of daily life. A coffee seller's call at Dawn might wake a whole street, while an Illman's evening shout signaled supper time. To modern ears, the endless shouting might sound chaotic, but to Victorians, it was part of the city's living fabric, as essential as church bells or factory whistles. The cries of street vendors turned London's sprawling food market into something more than commerce. They transformed it into theater, memory, and sound, a chorus of survival echoing through cobbled streets. For all its color and variety, Victorian street food carried a shadow, the very real danger of what you were putting into your mouth. In an age before modern food safety standards, reformers, doctors, and journalists often warned that the city's cheap eats might fill stomachs, but could just as easily spread disease. The problem started with hygiene. Vendors worked outdoors, surrounded by coal, soot, horse manure, and industrial smoke. Food was exposed to flies and dust, and many hawkers lacked access to clean water. Coffee stalls often reused the same mugs all day, rinsing them in a single dirty bucket between customers. Penny ice creams, famously served in communal glasses, might pass through a dozen mouths before being wiped with a rag and handed to the next eager child. Then there was adulteration, the art of stretching ingredients to save money. Pies sometimes contained more turnip than meat, if meat appeared at all. Sweets were brightened with toxic dyes like lead chromate or copper sulfate. Bread, though not strictly street food, was often bulked out with chalk or alum, and reformers suspected similar tricks in street snacks. To those already weakened by poverty, such adulteration wasn't just deceitful, it was deadly. Health reformers and social critics seized on these dangers. The press published sensational accounts of what might lurk inside a penny pie, with tales of horse meat, or worse, cats and dogs being minced into fillings. While some of these stories were exaggerated, they reflected genuine anxieties about the murky origins of street food. Reformers like Henry Mayhew, who chronicled London's poor, painted vivid pictures of vendors scraping by, often forced to cut corners simply to survive. Yet, despite the warnings, street food thrived. For the poor, it remained indispensable. A steaming plate of eels or a handful of chestnuts was better than nothing, and for many, there simply was no alternative. Even the middle classes, though wary, indulged in street treats when convenience or nostalgia outweighed fear. In a sense, Victorian street food culture lived in tension between necessity and danger. Reformers may have scolded, but Londoners kept buying, balancing the risk of sickness against the certainty of hunger. It was a gamble played every day in every alley where smoke curled from a hawker's brazier. Though the cries of hawkers have long faded, and the cold braziers are cold, the legacy of Victorian street food still lingers in Britain's culinary culture. What began as survival food for the poor laid the groundwork for traditions that endure today, shaping how London and the nation eats. Take the humble pie, once the staple of a penny hawker's cart. It evolved into the enduring institution of the pie and mash shop, still found in pockets of London. The jellied eel, born from the necessity of cheap Thames catches, remains a dish tied to East End identity, a taste of heritage rather than desperation. Even the penny ice cream served in shared glasses to grubby children foreshadowed the rise of mass-reduced ices that would become a summer staple across Britain, but beyond specific dishes, Victorian street food left a deeper imprint. It introduced the idea of convenience food. It's a concept that you could buy a hot meal quickly and cheaply without entering a tavern or waiting for table service was revolutionary. It created a rhythm of eating on the go that echoed into the 20th century with fish and chip shops, cafes, and eventually the fast food industry. Streets of Victorian London were in a sense the birthplace of modern grab-and-go dining. The legacy is also cultural. Street vendors, with their cries and rhymes, gave London its soundtrack, embedding food into the Bay City's identity. Writers like Dickens immortalized them, capturing how street food was inseparable from the experience of urban life. To To read about Victorian London without its hawkers would be like imagining the city without its fog or its cobblestones. At the same time, the health concerns that plagued Victorian street food spurred lasting change. Scandals about adulterated sweets and unsafe practices eventually pushed governments to enact food safety laws, laying the foundation for modern consumer protections. The tension between necessity, pleasure, and safety that defined Victorian street eating remains relevant today in debates over processed foods, additives, and fast food culture. In the end, Victorian street food was more than sustenance. It was survival, community, theater, and tradition rolled into one. Its flavors fit a city in transition, and its legacy continues every time Londoners grab a hot snack on the move. The streets may be quieter now, but echoes of those vendors still haunt the modern marketplace, reminding us that even the simplest foods can shape history. The story of the California Gold Rush begins quietly, almost accidentally, in January of 1848. James Marshall, a carpenter overseeing construction at Sutter's Mill along the American River, spotted something glinting in the water. At first, it seemed trivial, just another oddity in the stream. The word gold spread like wildfire, and what started as a whisper in a sawmill town exploded into one of the most frenzied migrations in history. By the summer of 1848, California, still technically a remote territory, was swarming with prospectors. Local rumors quickly traveled across the continent, carried by sailors, merchants, and letters that made their way east. Newspapers seized on the story, promising fortunes waiting just beneath the soil. By 1849, the trickle of fortune seekers had swelled into a tidal wave. They came to be known as the 49ers, an unlikely army of farmers, adventurers, laborers, and dreamers who packed their belongings and set out for the West. They came from everywhere. Americans caked overland in covered wagons, braving deserts and mountains. Ships set sail from Latin America, Australia, and even China, crammed with passengers willing to gamble everything on a chance at riches. San Francisco, a sleepy settlement of a few hundred, transformed almost overnight into a roaring boomtown, bursting with tents, saloons, and makeshift shops. Its harbor clogged with abandoned ships, their crews having deserted to chase gold upriver. Yet, the rush was never just about shiny nuggets. People carried with them recipes, tools, and traditions that collided in the rugged frontier. Alongside the gold pans came Dutch ovens, rice cookers, and coffee pots. Every miner needed food, and every boomtown needed cooks, bakers, and brewers. Almost instantly, a new food culture emerged, improvised, chaotic, and nothing like the polished refinement of Victorian dining rooms back east. The dream of instant wealth drove thousands west, but reality set in quickly. Striking it rich was rare. Striking it hungry was inevitable. With so many mouths to feed and so little infrastructure, California became a land of shortages, sky-high prices, and culinary improvisation. To understand the gold rush is to understand not only the fever for riches, but also the daily struggle to eat, cook, and survive in a world where civilization itself seemed half-built. The rush for gold had begun, but so too had the scramble for food. The dream of golden fortunes quickly collided with the reality of eating like a prospector. In the mining camps of California, meals were less about taste and more about survival. The frontier diet was crude, repetitive, and for many, downright depressing. Food shortages were constant, prices astronomical, and preparation often as rough as the men themselves. At the core of a miner's diet was flour. It was the building block of everything from flapjacks fried on a skillet to rough loaves of bread baked in Dutch ovens buried under hot coals. Flour was precious, so much so that a single barrel could cost its weight in gold, literally. Next came beans, dried, salted, and endlessly boiled. They filled bellies without emptying too many purses. Coffee, usually bitter and burnt, was the lifeblood of the camps, gulped down by lantern light before long days of digging and panning. But variety was rare. Fresh vegetables and fruit were nearly impossible to come by in the early years, especially in remote camps. Miners often went weeks without anything green on their plates. Scurvy, the dreaded disease caused by lack of vitamin C, haunted the camps, leaving men with bleeding gums and aching joints, when lucky prospectors might find onions or potatoes shipped in at outrageous prices. When not, they made do with salted pork or dried fish, foods that traveled well but offered little comfort. Cooking itself was usually a group affair. Camps pulled resources, and one unlucky soul was designated as the cook, often chosen not for talent, but for losing a bet or drawing the short straw. Meals were slung together quickly, with little care for refinement. A miner might eat beans for breakfast, bread and beans for lunch, and if fortune smiled, beans with a scrap of pork for dinner. Complaints were common, but with energy needed for back-breaking labor, calories mattered more than taste. Yet, even amid the monotony, food revealed the harshness of the frontier. Every cup of coffee, every spoonful of beans carried the weight of scarcity and improvisation. For men who had crossed deserts, oceans, and mountains chasing gold, eating was no feast. It was a daily reminder that in California, survival came before fortune. Digging for gold was backbreaking, paying for food was gut-wrenching. The California Gold Rush created one of the most chaotic food economies in American history, where scarcity and opportunity collided in spectacular fashion. Miners might not strike a vein of gold, but merchants selling flour, bacon, and eggs often became wealthier than the men in the rivers. The problem began with numbers. Tens of thousands poured into California almost overnight. But farms, mills, and supply chains simply didn't exist on a scale to support them. Every bag of flour, every barrel of beans had to be shipped overland across the Rockies or around Cape Horn on a months-long sea voyage. By the time it reached the mining camps, prices had skyrocketed. Reports from the early years tell of staggering costs. A single egg could fetch up to $1, equivalent to more than $30 today. Potatoes, onions, or apples, when they appeared, were treated like treasure, sometimes sold at auction to the highest bidder. Coffee was so expensive that some camps reused grounds multiple times, each brew weaker than the last. A loaf of bread might cost a fortune in gold dust, and fresh butter was almost mythical outside of San Francisco. The shortages shaped the very character of mining diets. Many miners subsisted on monotonous rations of beans, bacon, and bread, not out of preference, but necessity. When supplies ran low, some turned to desperate measures, trading tools, or even clothing for a few pounds of flour. Others relied on hunting and fishing, though over time, even wild game grew scarce, as thousands competed for the same resources. Meanwhile, the scarcity created a new kind of prospector, the entrepreneurial cook and merchant. Savvy individuals realized that feeding miners was often more profitable than mining itself. Camp cooks set up rough taverns, selling simple meals at outrageous prices. Entrepreneurs hauled food into camps with mule trains, charging what the market would bear, and the market would bear almost anything. The result was a frontier economy where food, not gold, was sometimes the most valuable currency. Food shortages turned every meal into a gamble. Would you spend your dust on a real dinner or save it for supplies to keep digging? In a land built on dreams of riches, hunger reminded everyone that fortune meant little if you couldn't afford to eat. The gold rush wasn't just an American story, it was global. By 1850, San Francisco and the mining camps were melting pots crowded with fortune seekers from Mexico, Chile, Peru, China, Australia, and Europe. It didn't just bring picks and shovels, it carried recipes, cooking techniques, and flavors that transformed frontier eating into something far more diverse than beans and bacon. One of the most visible influences came from Latin America. Chilean and Mexican miners introduced dishes built around beans, tortillas, and spiced meats. Chili peppers, virtually unknown in Anglo-American cooking at the time, found their way into stews and sauces, offering fiery relief from the monotony of boiled beans. Tamales, corn dough, stuffed with meat wrapped in husks, and steamed, became a common sight, sold in towns and mining camps alike. Then came the Chinese immigrants, who arrived by the thousands in the early 1850s. They brought with them rice, soy sauce, dried mushrooms, and techniques for stir-frying and steaming. In a region starved for variety, Chinese cooking stood out for its flavor and ingenuity. Their ability to make satisfying meals from meager supplies impressed even skeptical miners, though discrimination often forced Chinese communities into segregated quarters. Their food filtered outward, leaving an indelible mark on California's palate. Europeans added their own touches. Italians baked crusty breads and introduced pasta. French immigrants opened bakeries, bringing pastries and cafe culture to San Francisco. Germans brewed beer and made sausages, offering hearty alternatives to salt pork. Even Australians contributed, drawing on their own frontier experiences to adapt recipes for rugged conditions. What made this food culture remarkable was its improvisation. The supplies scarce and ingredients expensive. Immigrants often substituted local products or blended traditions, so a Chinese cook might season wild game with soy and ginger. A Mexican miner might use California corn to press tortillas. What emerged was not a faithful reproduction of old world cuisine, but a rough and ready hybrid suited to the gold rush environment. These culinary exchanges softened the harshness of frontier life. They offered moments of comfort and cultural pride, reminders of home in a strange and often hostile land. More importantly, they laid the foundation for California's future as a crossroads of global cuisine. Long before fusion became a culinary buzzword, the miners and migrants of the gold rush were living it. One tamale, one bowl of rice, one loaf of bread at a time. As miners poured into California, rough camps quickly sprouted into bustling towns, and with them came the first true restaurants and saloons of the frontier. For men weary of beans boiled over campfires, these establishments offered not just food and drink, but a taste of civilization, though often at an outrageous price. San Francisco became the epicenter of this new dining culture. By the early 1850s, the once sleepy port had exploded into a booming city filled with eateries catering to every wallet and appetite. At the top end, luxurious restaurants served multi-course meals imported at staggering cost, oysters from the East Coast, champagne from France, even exotic fruits shipped from Hawaii. For the wealthy few who struck it rich, dining out became a way to display success as much as to sat hunger. But most establishments were far humbler. Saloons dominated the frontier, doubling as restaurants, bars, and social centers. A miner could stumble in after a long day and order a plate of steak, bread, and potatoes if he could afford it. More often, saloons dished out simple stews, fried fish, or salted pork, washed down with strong whiskey or beer. Meals were quick, loud, and communal, served on long tables, sticky with spilled drinks. Prices were notoriously high. A single dinner in San Francisco could cost a miner the equivalent of several days' wages. Yet, demand never faltered. After weeks of monotonous camp food, the chance to eat something freshly prepared, and more importantly, to eat in company, was irresistible. Restaurants and saloons became social hubs where men gambled, traded news, and forged partnerships. Their conversations fueled by alcohol and the constant dream of striking it rich. Many entrepreneurs realized that feeding miners was often more lucrative than mining itself. Bakers, brewers, and butchers quickly became some of the wealthiest figures in the gold rush economy. Levi Strauss may have made his fortune with denim trousers, but countless others built empires selling bread. beer, or hearty meals to hungry 49ers. These early establishments left a lasting imprint. They set the stage for California's restaurant culture, blending European, American, and immigrant traditions in a chaotic but vibrant scene. In the end, saloons and restaurants were more than places to eat. They were where miners reconnected with humanity, even as the wilderness of the gold rush loomed just beyond the town's edge. While the gold rush is often remembered as a man's world, rowdy saloons, muddy camps, and endless digging, the role of women in shaping food culture was profound. Though few in number compared to men, women found opportunity not in the mines, but in the kitchens, bakeries, and boarding houses that fed the fortune hunters. In many cases, they earned more from cooking than most men did from panning gold. At first, the sheer scarcity of women gave them unique leverage. A woman who could cook a decent meal, bake bread, or wash clothes could command astonishing prices.